Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Chagrin Documentary Film Festival panel discussion with Chris Zaluski. That was the correct pronunciation, correct?
Yep, you're good.
I love it. Fresco artist Christopher Holt and Pastor Brian Combe of Hayward Street Ministry, where we will discuss the motivation, making of, and impact of Theirs is the Kingdom, which follows the rare creation of a contemporary fresco mural inside the sanctuary of a small church in Asheville, North Carolina. It's a delicately hopeful, consciousness-raising piece that introduces us to the individuals who inspired the fresco, exposes us to the century-old tradition of painting, and discusses our rising homelessness crisis, the dehumanization of the poor, and perhaps what we can do better as a society moving forward. I'd like to start with a question for Christopher and Brian. Christopher and Brian, in the film you mentioned that before the official starting of the Fresco project, securing funding, etc., you talked about making this work for many years. What initially inspired you to make this fresco?
Well, I mean, I think the initial inspiration was just what Brian and Haywood Street were doing for our community. And kind of like we were introduced by a mutual friend, Rob Blackburn, but I spent, some years just being a member of the community. I would go to Haywood Street on a Wednesday and sit in the back of the sanctuary and draw people that were coming to find a meal or to worship. And so it really kind of unfolded just from what they were doing for folks, like me or anyone who can step in onto the campus there and become, part of what's happening.
I love that. How about you, Brian?
Yeah, the provocation for the painting really began quite early in my time on the streets in urban ministry, and surprisingly to me, having loitered on the corner with folks for so many years, I would have expected the most devastating part of poverty to be the instability, the worry about your safety, lack of material access. But what I heard consistently people say that the most painful part is feeling invisible, that I am not seen, even though I'm living this life on public display in a way that feels shameful to me. I literally am in the public square for thousands of people to drive by me, and yet almost no one makes eye contact. I literally get looked through as if I'm a non-human being on the daily, and that very much formed my understanding of what a day in the life is like, and a fresco to communicate the exact opposite of that in this incredibly permanent medium felt like a validation of what we believe as a church, that no, actually God sees you as a person of sacred worth. But to do it in perpetuity felt like a grand statement, and to do it in art very much felt like who we are as a church.
That's amazing. I love that you guys have in your ministry, you guys have like an art room and all these really engaging activities for everyone in the community. And I remember you mentioning in the film that you had taken some art history classes, which is so exciting. When did you start having an interest in art history? Was this before your practice in ministry? Was this around the same time? When did your passion for art and talking about the narrative behind it take place for you?
My grandmother taught at the Pratt Institute in New York City. She was a professional watercolorist, and my mother worked in art for a while, and my degree is actually in industrial design as an undergrad. Literally was just reading the profile on Jasper Johns, the New York Times yesterday. I'm convinced the greatest metaphor for God is creator. There are many, mighty fortress, potter, on and on, but creator is the one that most resonates for me, and visual arts in particular have captivated me from a young age. And Haywood Street, even though most people wouldn't make this connection, everything we've done has been a one-off. It didn't exist in a prior iteration before, and the ideation process of bringing something from inspiration to the page to literally something that breathes feels very much like I'm in a studio, even though the the raw materials are a little different. It very much feels like the same process.
I love that.
That's a really beautiful metaphor. I'm here for it. The artistry in your delivery as well. Wonderful. Here, let me see here. I had a little pop up. Okay. So how did the project of making this fresco evolve into making a documentary feature? And how did Chris get involved? How did you get incorporated into the community here? And how did you guys decide that Chris was the right person to empathetically tell this story?
Well, I could talk about how I got involved, and I'll let Brian and Christopher talk about how they deemed me worthy enough to film the process. But I know a woman named Brooke Vanderlyn who works at Haywood Street. She's actually the storyteller in residence, which I think speaks to how Haywood Street views the power of story and the transformative power of story, that they have somebody on staff with that title. And so I had actually worked with Brooke on a previous documentary, and she told me about this fresco. This was early days. I mean, 3.5 years ago, 4 years ago now, when it was still a concept, the funding was still up in the air. And so I decided I'll go to the church. I had never been to the church before. And I listened to a dialogue that was happening. And Brian spoke and Christopher spoke. And as you probably just heard, fairly captivating concepts, and the idea behind it and the deeper themes behind it just drew me in. And so what started as, in my mind, maybe a 5 or 10 minute short film with a handful of different shoots turned into a 3-year process with over 50 shoots. And it just became a big part of my life. And I was grateful for Brian and Christopher for kind of opening their doors, literally and figuratively, to let me follow them and follow the church and follow the artistic process in Christopher's case. But it really did evolve. I mean, I did not intend for this to be the film when I started, but it really drew me in, and the more people I met that were part of the fresco, the more curious I became.
Amazing. How about you, Brian? How was your process deciding that Chris was the right person to tell this story of the fresco creation happening in your ministry?
We do something at the beginning of every worship service where we affirm our baptism. And in Christian theology, there is this belief that baptism means many things, claiming identity as child of God, but also it's a commissioning. And one of the great perversions, in my opinion, of faith is that somehow only the clergy have a ministry. But at the font of baptism, what we are saying is no, actually, everyone has a ministry. Some are clerical, some are not, some are lay, some are professional, but God needs all of it. And the truth is, Chris showed up and said, I feel led to do this. And the answer was yes. There was no vetting process. Nobody checked his references. You're here with the camera and you feel led to do this, so we trust you. And it literally wasn't any more complicated than that. And that's simply the way I believe church ought to live in the world anyway. We're just going to assume you have something that the world needs. And my responsibility, among others, is I'm just not going to get in your way. What can I do to encourage you? And Chris was off and running almost from day one. It was just, okay, how can we make this easier for you?
That's beautiful. What was your guys' process of choosing who was going to be featured in the fresco, and also simultaneously who was going to be featured in the documentary?
The fresco choice, that was like kind of like my worst, my kind of worst case problem for the project, was that inevitably people were going to be left out. So I really tried my best to honor those folks who had been there from the beginning of Haywood Street and its creation, and choose the folks who by being in it actually represented a group of another group or others. And so It just kind of unfolded organically from that kind of outset. And, there were some folks we wanted in there that we couldn't track down, and that didn't work out. And there were some folks who were meant to be in there all along that you never could have planned for. So it kind of in the Haywood Street mantra, it really just kind of, the folks that made it, or that are the representative characters in the story, were the ones that were just led to be there. And that was it all worked out pretty well. But that was kind of like my the back of my mind, the leaving somebody out, which is the antithesis of Haywood Street's kind of core belief of being represented and being seen. That was a worrisome process.
And I mean, from a documentary standpoint, I was fortunate that I would ask Christopher, who he was sketching, and usually those sketching sessions would take 2 or even 3 days, and ask him if he felt the person would be comfortable on camera, or if they were talkative or whatever. But most of the time I wanted it to be in the background, a fly on the wall type of thing, out of the way. I didn't want to affect the artistic process of the sketching that took place and everything else. But another thing I would say, and I know Brian has refuted this a couple times when I've said this, but I came at this story as an outsider, meaning like I was not familiar with Haywood Street, or I was familiar with Haywood Street, but I had not, been to the campus before or anything like that. And so I also wanted to make sure that I was, cognizant that I was telling this story as an outsider, but I needed, Brian and Christopher to kind of almost say like, all right, this guy's good. You could trust this person. And I never was made to feel like an outsider, but from a filmmaking standpoint, that was always kind of at the top of my mind, was that I really wanted to be respectful and let people talk was really the main thing. I didn't want to edit their stories in the way that it's often, poverty is often portrayed in film and in the 6 o'clock news, especially, which is sound bites. And so in terms of who to choose for the film, it was really like if people were willing to talk with me and open up to me, that was the first step. But a lot of times I was leaning on Brian and Christopher to kind of open those doors initially, knowing that was a big part of establishing trust. So, yeah.
Awesome. You mentioned how, like in the 6 o'clock news, they have sound bites that kind of illustrate the typical narratives of homelessness. Throughout the making of the documentary, Chris, and then also your guys' process of making the fresco and being directly exposed to these stories, and Brian, with your 11 plus years of ministry, what was some of the most shocking stories of homelessness that you heard? I know watching the film myself, there was a couple of stories where it was completely unexpected. Like specifically the ashes in the garden. I had never really thought about someone who's homeless, like what happens there. So that was a very new piece of information for me. What was a new story that you guys hadn't heard before throughout the making of this film?
For me personally, the most powerful story is Jerry at the end, who talks about, surviving abuse his whole life, and bouncing around to different foster homes and, eventually ending up in Asheville homeless. If the story itself isn't shocking, I guess what resonates with me most about Jerry's story in particular is just that if you see somebody who's suffered decades of abuse, physical, emotional, mental abuse, and this person ends up homeless and broken and without a safety net to survive, how else would you expect somebody who's gone through this type of treatment to end up? And in a lot of ways, it just empathizes the whole experiences, which is why his story resonates with me so much. And so I guess it's less shocking because I think we've all heard these type of headlines and these types of stories. But for me, the way he says it and the way he talks about it and is just so honest and open with it, that just really hit me hard. And I even remember filming that and tearing up as he was talking about it. And so that part for me resonates, but I don't know if it's necessarily the most shocking, but it certainly affected me the most, or one of the most. Jeanette's also another story that really affected me, but that was me personally.
Right. How about you, Christopher or Brian?
I mean, the revelation of dealing with folks who are living on the street is, drawing everybody from life and being at Haywood Street like Brian is every day. And honestly, you're always hearing or finding out about somebody, and that's really the overwhelming thing, is that these are just a few picked out of the crowd. There's a whole wave of humanity that's in trouble. And I think that the hard part is just, if you're in the environment, is that I feel the responsibility in some way to bring around joy to folks' lives, because to compare, if you have a house, you've got it made. I mean, now that's a very generalized statement, but it changes a lot of things that happen for you in your life. So, I mean, I can't say that was one person, but just being a part of the community and seeing, because I mean, when you're working there, you're walking out of the sanctuary every day, and there's a new person that's all having hard times, and so it's easy to get caught up in our lives and not directly think or empathize or be compassionate about people who are struggling. It's easy to just check your list and see where your errands are taking you, and you're picking up your children and all that, but there's a whole world of hurt just outside the window pane. So I think just kind of coming to terms with that in your own kind of way as a human being, Earth, is something that we really kind of tackle.
How about you, Brian? Any stories that particularly struck you, or perhaps like a story that you heard that made this like one of your core missions for your ministry?
What resonated most for me, two things. One was, we didn't know when the Fresco and the documentary began that Charles Burns was dying of cancer. And it felt like we got to co-create the last chapter of his life. Literally, we were with him in his last breaths, and to be able to record him not only in plaster and pigment, but on film in a way immortalizes his imprint on Haywood Street. He was the first person that believed in me on the streets, and he's one of those elders that I will forever have reverence for. I also found it very curious that Jerry Bowman, who Chris was referencing, I've been on endless backpacking trips with him. We've built Habitat for Humanity houses. We've slept together in tents. We have shared life, and he has never told me about that abuse. And it wasn't until I watched the documentary, that was the place where I literally wept. That something about being held up in the Fresco, and Christopher did a beautiful thing and put Jerry in an empathetic posture where he gets to help someone. And then Chris put him in the movie as well. And something about that changed Jerry's self-confidence. And to be able to lead with that kind of vulnerability and story on film, that took my breath away, and it still does.
I love that. Christopher, I have a question with your process of drawing everyone. When you were doing the initial portraits with everyone, is it kind of like when you're at a hair salon, you're chatting with them the whole time, or is it just a moment of like silence? Is there music? Do you also kind of feel a little bit more of like a caretaker role, just given the amount of weight that these people emotionally live with every day?
Definitely want your subject to be comfortable. And so we would have coffee and little snacks, and everybody would choose. I would ask each sitter what they wanted to listen to. And like Charlie, for instance, Charlie loved the blues. I mean, we are rocking the blues in my studio. But everybody's different. Some people are just a lot more introspective, and others want to talk the whole time. And we won't name any names, Rachel, but some people just like the running conversation, and that's fine. So and Rachel would laugh at that joke, but when I would be like, okay, Rachel, I'm gonna try to draw your mouth right now. So you pull it together. But that's the fun part of it, and the back and forth, and the getting to know somebody, and really translating that whole idea that it's people. People need to be seen. No one wants to be looked over, and so that whole studio time really is really and drawing from life, and doing it in that way, that's the reason you do it, is because you really see somebody, you get to know them, and you befriend them, and hopefully that translates through the artwork.
I love that. Was the iconography you attached to every person clear from the beginning, or was that something you discovered just throughout the process of getting to know them personally in these portrait sessions, and also through Brian's time? What was your process with discovering that iconography?
I had a composition that I worked for about a year on, in order to have an infrastructure to go for when the model started sitting. So I had places that needed to be figured out. Now those there were some slight alterations along the way, but for the most part, I stuck to what I was, each placeholder that I was going for, and kind of what happened with maybe their body language, or how that could have been informed by each person. But for the most part, that's the thing about doing a fresco, is you really have to kind of be prepared for the steps. And so having the composition, and then moving into the drawing from life, and then blowing those up, it's not quite it's not quite jazz in that way. Your improvisation can happen, but maybe a jazz person would agree that there's still an infrastructure that they're building on. So anyway, that's a debate for another Zoom. But yeah, I guess it was a little bit of both, but for the most part, I knew what we needed to get from the characters, or from the models.
Got it. And what was your origin story actually into getting into verbiage, getting into fresco art? And I'm going to open this to Chris and Brian too, with your guys' disciplines as well. But we'll start with Christopher first. How did you first get into fine art and then transition into fresco painting?
Well, I have spent my life as an artist, and I was lucky enough I moved back to Asheville, North Carolina at the time that Ben Long was starting a small art school, and Ben is a fresco painter in North Carolina of some great renown. And as I started working with him as a student, he received the fresco project that took place in Morganton, North Carolina, and I was able to apprentice on that project, and then thereon, because it really is a technique that it's a hands-on team kind of. You really got to get in there and do it to kind of know what's going on. And I was lucky enough to work with them, and just kind of happened that way for me.
Amazing. Chris, how about you? How did you first get started into working in documentary film, and what was your initial passion point with that?
Sure. I was a print journalist for a couple of years. That's what I always wanted to be, was a newspaper reporter. And I was a reporter for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and then the Roanoke Times in Roanoke, Virginia, around 2008, where it wasn't a great time. I don't know if it's still not a great time, but they were trying to get everybody to do 3 or 4 different things. So it wasn't just writing an article, it was doing a video and taking photos. And so I got more into video production that way. I had a little bit of background with my undergrad degree, but basically that just turned more and more into long form video and documentary. And then I got a master's in it, and really started doing it more just for the video side of it, and left the newspaper world behind. So, but really it started as just a traditional print journalist.
Nice.
Mm.
And Brian, how did you get in from UX design in your art world into ministry? I'm so curious about this transition. That's awesome.
Yeah, I worked as a designer in Raleigh for a number of years, and I remember standing at the ideation bench and thinking, at my very best from 30 years of doing this, I may get to work on the next iPhone or the updated Volkswagen Beetle, and that would be incredible. That would be the pinnacle of a design career. Mm-hmm. And for me, it felt like there was a missing altruism to that, that left me with a vacancy. And I had grown up at church camp, and my job there was to wash dishes. That's what I did every summer. And that act of service was so incredibly fulfilling. And at the bench there that day, I said, something has to change. And that's when I started moving towards seminary with little sense about where that would take me, only that I had to follow. But I still claim this identity as artist. It's not fully realized, especially not as a painter, which I would love to spend my days as Christopher does in lots of ways. But I'm a hybrid of so many different things, and can continue to create in a church setting right now. But it began in the artist studio, and now I'm in the sanctuary, and where they overlap is where I feel most alive.
That's so beautiful. And kind of like your career being a hybrid of art and ministry and impact, this film very much feels like that. It's such a beautiful balance of, exploring this age-old tradition of fresco creation, and then your ministry work and all of the people. And it's so beautifully balanced. I feel like you can watch this film and not be a spiritual person, or you can watch this film and be a very devout spiritual person who's very rooted in that community. I understand that the initial funding of the fresco, which you guys got that huge $72,000 grant, which is so exciting, with acquiring the funding in order to create this fresco, was that a seamless process? I know in the film you kind of mentioned that there was some difficulties with the few religious groups based in Asheville. So what was your guys' process and challenge of acquiring the funding to do this project for the community?
We were really lucky to have a philanthropic leader named Pam Siegman, who never let us feel deterred in the fact that we were going to make this fresco. So when we decided to just turn down the grant from the tourism board of Asheville, we just kept moving in another direction. Pam is an incredible human being, and we wouldn't be sitting here having this Zoom without her. And she just led the way of our team. We had a team assembled that was the fresco team that did all of the thinking and the moves behind it to raise the money within and raise the money outside of Haywood Street's normal kind of audience, so that we would bring in new people and kind of we focused on the art community. But it was really just her expertise and her knowledge and her care, along with the other folks on our team, that led the way. Just it was a meeting where we sat down and we were pretty much in agreement that we would, before the date, we decided to challenge any idea of that we deserve the money or whatever. We just decided to let it pass and move on.
I mean, and ultimately that's how I originally got connected, was through the funding controversy, thinking that was the story. And it is in the film for maybe a minute, but it's, ultimately was so much bigger than that. And I'm really grateful that it was. I think we all are. So.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. I have a couple of final questions for you all. What do you hope audiences take away from watching the film? Big question. Do
you want me to go with this one? I guess
sure.
I should answer this one first.
Yeah.
I've thought about this a lot, and I've written about it too. For me, it's empathy. I mean, Brian said originally in this call, and in the very first interview I had with Brian, about people not being seen being the most dehumanizing part of poverty. And so from the very beginning, I really wanted that idea of empathy to come through. And there's even some editing choices that are made throughout the film that are not very traditional, that may even strike people as a little jarring, where I'm constantly putting people's stories side by side with their depiction in the fresco. And that gets to that idea that you're taking segments of the population that have been marginalized and have been unseen, and you're making them put literally in stone. And that gets back to that idea of empathy and really trying to elevate those stories and make those stories matter. And so I hope people, at the very least, see this film and they don't avert their eyes when they see people at the intersection asking for money or food or whatever it might be. I hope they don't avert their eyes. I mean, that's a really small thing, but I think about that every time I get in my car. And that was one of the first things Brian said to me, and it drew me to this film, and it has ultimately kind of led how I hope the film is seen by others. So, in a word, empathy. That would be my hope.
How about you, Christopher and Brian? Do you guys have any hopes for people who, after they watch this film, takeaways that they may have?
I hope that they see the possibilities for for themselves in their lives, and how you can affect people in your community. I mean, whether you're seeing people in a new way, or just a more compassionate, empathetic way, or you find a way to get involved. I mean, Wood Street is just a great example, and you see many small ways in the film in what happens when you work together with same way that you don't do a giant fresco all by yourself either. You see everybody hustling. I had a great crew, and things don't get done, in the solo world. We're all working together somehow. And I think, along with what Chris said, that the big lesson here is that we're in this together.
How about you, Brian? Do you have any takeaways?
The word I would pick is salvific, and that is such a loaded term in Christianity. It's used legible, but if you go back to the original language, it just means living into God's intended fullness for our lives. And one of the big misnomers in Christianity, especially, is that salvation in this life is an individualized pursuit. I hope a takeaway from the movie is that my liberation is bound up in someone that I don't think is like me. And rather than being invited to help the homeless, to help someone in poverty, to offer bottled water or a granola bar, those are great. Instead, I wonder if the deeper invitation is that person standing on the corner when I'm idling at the red light, maybe they have something that I need that I can't give myself. And if I'm willing to be courageous enough to move towards them, to learn their name, to share a meal with them, perhaps even share life, then my wholeness will be further realized in this moment, rather than us and them. Let me find a way to further the distance. In my opinion, Salvific intention that comes from God always requires community, especially with someone that we would never choose on our own.
Love it. I have another question for Chris, actually. Earlier, I asked Christopher about his process with doing portraiture and sitting down with everyone. When you were interviewing all of your subjects, how did you go about creating a place of comfort for them to open up about these deep stories that Brian mentioned, that stories that he hadn't even heard before? And so how did you make everyone feel comfortable, and what questions did you come with beforehand, or was it all kind of spontaneous?
So a number of folks I interviewed twice. So a lot of them I would talk to while they were being sketched, and then I would either go back to Haywood Street to interview them, or in a couple of situations like Rachel, who had housing at the time, like I went to her house, and so a couple times it was 2 different interviews, which always helps establish more trust when you're talking to people repeatedly. I guess for one thing, and Charlie Burns was mentioned earlier in the talk, and he was the first person I spoke with. And Charlie he was the first to kind of help elevate Haywood Street and be there. And I think when people saw that Charlie was willing to open up, that opened a lot of doors that folks said, okay, this person could be trusted. But I did not go in with questions. I went in and just listened to what they had to say and had a conversation with them. Fortunately, they were having to be seated for 2, 3, 4 hours anyway, because Christopher was sketching them. So I had them, in a quiet space. But a lot of it was just being quiet and listening, and asking little questions here and there. But, some folks wanted to talk more than others. And if I felt like it was being a nuisance, or they were uncomfortable, either for the film, but also for the art process, like I didn't want to get in the way of the sketching that was happening either, then I would turn the camera off, or I would stop asking questions for a while, and that was fine. And some folks I would maybe see a week or 2 or a month later, and I'd ask them if they wanted to talk some more, and maybe they came around with it, and maybe they didn't, and that was totally fine as well. So, it was just a patient process. It's tough to establish trust with somebody who has a camera. That's not really a natural process. And so it just takes time and patience and a lot more listening than talking. And so it's tough to boil down the process, but it was mostly just me being quiet. Mostly me being quiet behind a camera and trying to ask questions, but really just listen. So I don't know if that answers that.
I've heard a helpful distinction between a liturgical musician, someone who plays in worship, and say a rock star in an entertainment venue. And the difference is the person on stage is trying to train the attention of the audience on them. They are under the spotlight, whereas the liturgical musician is trying to be an instrument to point people's attention to something far bigger, far more sacred. And with Christopher and Chris, what I noticed, one reason I trust both of them is there was an absence of ego. Christopher wasn't painting because he was trying to do something that was self-aggrandizing, and Chris wasn't holding a camera because he ultimately was intoxicated by the image of himself. There was a humility in which both of them entered the community that made people feel like this is safe space to share, to be seen, to be recorded, to be drawn. And I'd like to believe you can see that in the fresco and in the documentary because of the way in which they chose to posture themselves, which I give them a lot of credit for. That was done with great care and intention.
Thank you, Brian.
Yes. And I have your usual what's next question for you guys. What are you all currently working on? What are you guys excited for and looking forward to working on in the future? What's next for you guys after the final exhibition of Theirs is the Kingdom?
Me personally, I teach as well. I teach at the Wake Forest University Documentary Film program. So I have some syllabi I need to create. But I have a few other films that I'm kicking around right now, but really early pre-production, pitch deck type of stage of things. And I mean, one of the things I wanted to do with this film in particular was make sure that the rollout and distribution of it was really given the time and effort that it deserves. And so before I dive into another project, at least another big project, I want to see that this film has been out there and in the right avenues and, with enough screenings and grassroots screenings, which we're doing. So I guess, I don't really have a great answer for that, but a few other projects and then just the continued rollout of the film pretty much. Yeah.
That is a great answer. That's exciting.
Yeah.
Yes. How about you, Christopher? You mentioned in the pre-interview that you have some fun projects in the works here.
I am about to move to Raleigh and do a large wall painting on silverleaf in a cancer hospital that the Rex and UNC hospital are building. And it's some kind of a nature-based picture it's going to be called The Blessing of Butterflies. And it will include one, it's not confirmed yet. I'm hoping it includes one figure of kind of a compassionate presence, which really kind of is carrying on a certain spirit of Haywood Street. But I don't know if that I have a Zoom tomorrow to kind of continue my compositional discussion with the crew. So we'll see how that goes. But yeah, that'll be this fall, and I'll be there for 7 or 8 weeks. So I'm gearing up for that right now.
Awesome. How about you, Brian? How are you guys doing with the COVID-19 pandemic? How have you guys evolved your worship space and, worked around all of the different codes regarding number of people in a public space and all of that?
Sure, we're still seeing hundreds of people a week. We've pivoted everything to the parking lot. We've got some temporary tents out there where we do food, clothes, worship. We've kept the lobby and the sanctuary open for people to have a place to congregate who don't have housing, and the sanctuary so folks can access the fresco. It's been a harrowing time. We're all first responders a year and a half in. Our staff's tired. There's a fatigue among us that's real, just like in so many other sectors of American life and the world at this point. And in terms of what's next for us, we've been pushing hard on a deeply affordable housing project, and we're under contract on a piece of land, and hope to be before City Council by the end of the year to fund this project, so that some of the folks that we've learned about in the Fresco can have a forever home.
Wow, that's a very beautiful project. I'm so excited that you guys are getting that off the ground. It's going to be so wonderful for Asheville and a wonderful model for other cities as well who are struggling with this homelessness crisis and gentrification issues and things like that. Final question. We kind of touched on this a little bit with the aftermath question, but in watching the film, how do you think audiences can be better? Like, what kind of community action steps can we take in order to kind of unlearn the stigmas and stereotypes that have been impressed into our brains about homeless people versus people who find themselves in a position of homelessness? I know, Chris, you mentioned the whole averting your eyes thing. Just looking at people and seeing them is a small act for which you can help these people feel human again, feel just as they are. But what are your guys' thoughts on that, and how we as an audience can watch your film and then take action steps moving forward to be better?
I'll say that seeing, there's just a very present honor that Chris paid tribute to each of the people that are in the film. And how he captured them and presented them as they are, as human beings. And, we're talking to in the film and in the Fresco who they were the person on the street corner. So, making taking the stigma out of your mind that there's something wrong with folks who are down and out is the biggest key. And it's portrayed in the documentary that they're just people, they're like you and I. So I think it's that, just translating that moment, those moments of seeing people for who they are. And everybody's got baggage and a story, and some is much more horrific than others. But in the present, it's you who can see them for how they are right in that moment and move forward in a new direction.
I mean, yeah, the documentary is not solution driven. It's much more meditative. But I think that it really is it's not a one size fits all answer. And I think that a lot of the interstitials where the news broadcasts and things like that are used in the film, it shows, that all of the approaches that the city of Asheville has taken and how difficult, trying to apply a one size fits all solution is. And so, I wish more communities had Haywood streets. Not to branch off on your church, Brian. But there are a lot of really wonderful organizations and a lot of communities that I think just showing up and being present and hearing stories and not going with the idea that you have a solution, but going there with an open mind and an open heart to talk to folks. I think that that's where it starts. And so, who knows from where people will be watching this film, but I think that, knowing that the most important thing is talking to one another and being open to hear other people's stories, and being open to being vulnerable yourself. I think that's really where it can begin. And so that would be what I hope.
How about you, Brian? Any other notes and things to do? I know you mentioned how a lot of people often give the essential goods, like here's some toothbrush, here's some toothpaste. And in the film, you largely talk about how we should be giving, not only community, but we should be giving art. Do you have any ideas of ways that we as the general public can do that? Like, for example, my sister in her car, she has like a little care package of sorts. I'm based over in Cleveland, and we have a really, concerning amount of people who find themselves to be homeless here. And so she gives them like goodie bags and things, and it's a mixed reception of gratitude versus like I don't want this and I don't need this. Do you have any suggestions of like action steps that we can do? Like, should we like go to the Cleveland Museum of Art and give like little postcards of art and a flower and like just nice tender things? Or do you have any thoughts on what we can do there?
When it comes to direct service and urban ministry, usually there's almost a hysteria around measurable outcomes. The only response has to be something that's quantifiable. I would argue do the exact opposite. And in fact, begin with the assumption that love always requires proximity. Can't do it at a distance. And if we are going to do something, then let's not do something that we can fill out on a ledger. Instead, look at someone, touch somebody, eat with somebody, experience awe with someone, share music with someone. Again, that begins with the assumption too that I may actually be the person in far greater need than whatever the material deficit of the person in front of me is. Begin with the assumption of reciprocity close up, and then see what happens. And my guess is it will be surprising. You likely won't be able to write it down on a form somewhere that a grantor wants to see, but you likely will come out of it with a heart that's been transformed.
This is good to know. Thank you guys so much for being here today and spending time with us here at the Chagrin Documentary Film Festival. We're genuinely so excited to showcase your film and share it with our audiences here in Chagrin and abroad. Few final notes here. The film is going to be screening at the film festival virtually throughout the entire fest, and it's going to be screening in person on Thursday, October 7th at 3:15. We hope you get a chance to watch it. We hope you get a chance to support the project as well as Hayward Street. I attached some links below for you guys to click on and explore. And thank you guys so much for being here and engaging in this wonderful conversation. And thank you guys so much for watching. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
you.